Have you ever stopped to think about what really happened on September 11th, 2001? What you know, or rather what you were told about that day, could be just one part of a much bigger and scarier story. Behind the terrified faces, the incessant news reports and official explanation, there may be something much darker lurking, something that until now has been covered up by the government and those who truly control this world. Now imagine a man who, for years, carried the burden of a truth that few would have the courage to bear. This man, a high-ranking agent for the United States government, witnessed something that made him question everything he knew. His name is Rudolph Harmat Robinson, and he was there, at the heart of power, at the center of events, closely observing every move, every decision, and every secret. Do you think you've heard everything about 9/11? Rudolph, former White House Chief of Staff, guarantees that the story that was told to the world is far from reality. In the shadowy hallways and closed-door meetings of the White House, he uncovered a conspiracy that transcends governments, ideologies, and even human understanding. They weren't just terrorists, they weren't just enemies of another country or religious fanatic. No. What was behind that attack was something else, something that came from far away, something that was not of this world. Rudolph knew that by revealing this truth, he would be risking his life and the lives of everyone around him, but the weight of this discovery was too great to keep secret. He was threatened, persecuted, and silenced several times, but he never gave up. He knew that one day the time would come to speak, and now he finally decided to tell everything. So what would you do if you knew your country's leaders were in cahoots with extraterrestrial forces, that the fate of thousands of people, perhaps even all of humanity, was in the hands of beings from another world? That 9/11 was just the surface of a much deeper conspiracy. Rudolph is ready to take us on this journey, a journey where reality and nightmare mix. Brace yourself, because this story is not for the faint of heart. This is the truth the government never wanted you to know, and once you start listening, there will be no turning back. On that sunny morning of September 11th, 2001, the world stopped. Shock and disbelief gripped everyone watching, whether on the streets of New York or on television, as two commercial planes crashed into the iconic Twin Towers. Thousands of lives were lost in a matter of minutes, and what seemed like an unprecedented terrorist action quickly became a milestone of pain and fear for an entire generation. However, as the public watched in horror, Rudolph Harmat Robinson, former White House Chief of Staff, knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Rudolph was far from the scene of the attacks that morning, but his connections to the heart of the government kept him informed of every move, every decision. He had already begun to realize that something dark was going on behind the scenes, but nothing could prepare him for what he was about to discover. The initial shock that gripped millions of people was not the same as the one that hit Rudolph. For him, that attack was not a simple act of terror, but the result of a series of decisions and agreements made far beyond the borders of what we know as reality. The official narrative that began to emerge soon after the attacks, that extremist groups in the Middle East had planned and carried out everything, was only a fraction of the truth. Behind the scenes, senior government figures exchanged nervous glances and whispered words about something bigger. What the public did not know was that these attacks had somehow been predicted, and most disturbingly, preventable. For Rudolph, it wasn't just what was happening that bothered him, but why they let it happen. He knew the official version would be given to the media quickly, before anyone could ask questions, but something inside him forced him to go deeper. Why did this all seem so orchestrated? Why, from the beginning of his political career, did he hear rumors of invisible forces acting behind the scenes of power? Rudolph felt more and more drawn into a web of lies and secrets that were beginning to crumble in his mind. His instinct warned him. What was behind that attack was not what it seemed. The tragedy that paralyzed the world was much more than an act of terror. It was the result of something much more sinister. And while the president and his advisors dealt with the crisis, Rudolph knew that the answers weren't there. In the White House meeting rooms, they were in a much deeper, much darker place. It was shortly after the attacks, during a national security meeting, that the first piece of the puzzle revealed itself to Rudolph. He was sitting in a stuffy room, observing the heated discussions between the generals and intelligence advisors. President Bush was in the center of the table, his expression stern and distant. Everyone there was focused on understanding how those attacks could happen, how they had gone unnoticed by the most advanced defense systems in the world. But there was something in Bush's eyes. A shadow, Rudolph noticed, that didn't fit the gravity of the moment. It was fear, but not the kind of fear you expect when facing a national crisis. It was a personal fear, something deeper. Shortly after the meeting, Rudolph was called for a private conversation with the president. Bush's tone was different, darker and more urgent. When they entered the Oval Office, the president locked the door and approached Rudolph with a tense look. "I need to tell you something," Bush began hesitantly, "but you won't believe it." "No one will." Rudolph's breathing became heavy. He knew he was about to hear something that would change everything. This goes beyond what you think. Far beyond these attacks were permitted. We had warnings. But not from where you might think. Rudolph was silent, absorbing every word. "What do you know about them, Rudolph? About the others?" Not fully understanding, Rudolph tried to remain calm. "The others?" he asked, his voice shaking. "The others," Bush repeated, looking around the room as if he were being watched. "The ones that aren't from here." And then, in a barely audible whisper, the president revealed a shocking truth. There was a secret treaty, something done during Bill Clinton's administration. The United States government had made a pact with alien entities, beings that do not belong to this world, not even to this dimension. The agreement was simple. In exchange for technological and scientific advances, the aliens would have access to certain human biological resources, an agreement that should never have been known to the public. Rudolph was paralyzed. At first he thought it was a joke or some kind of psychological test, but the president's pale face and wide eyes confirmed the truth. Those beings were real. And worst of all, they wanted more. The treaty was threatened, and 9/11 wasn't just a terrorist attack. It was a sign. The aliens were losing patience, and the government was at the limit of its ability to contain them. Rudolph then understood that he was immersed in something much bigger and much more terrifying than he could ever imagine. After Bush's disturbing revelation, Rudolph no longer knew what was real. The president's words echoed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. A treaty with beings from another world? This seemed impossible. And yet there was a dark, irrational part of him that knew it made sense. There were details that he had always ignored, inexplicable situations throughout his political career that, seen from this new perspective, began to fall into place. But it was one thing to hear about it. It was another to see it with your own eye. It was one night, a few weeks after 9/11, that Rudolph had his first contact with these entities. He was working late at the White House, reviewing reports and memos, trying to make sense of the new reality. Most of the staff had already left, except for a few guards and security assistants. The atmosphere in the building was heavy, as if something invisible was hovering over everyone there. Around 11 p.m., while Rudolph was organizing some document, he heard footsteps outside his office. It was late, and that was unusual. When he went to check, he saw a group of 3 men walking towards the Oval Office. They wore impeccable black suits and walked with a rigid, almost mechanical posture. What immediately caught Rudolph's attention was the fact that none of them looked familiar. He knew practically every White House staffer, and those faces didn't belong to anyone he'd ever seen. Driven by curiosity and growing fear, he followed them from afar. The men disappeared through a side door of the Oval Office, and Rudolph, careful not to be noticed, watched from a small opening. What he saw next confirmed his worst fears. The door closed behind them, and the light in the room changed, as if a presence, something non-human, had filled the room. It wasn't a feeling of heat or cold, but a dense, suffocating vibration. Rudolph saw the silhouettes of those men begin to change. Their once perfectly human bodies began to contort and stretch. Their faces deformed, transforming into something reptilian, with yellow eyes that glowed in the dark. Terror took over him, but at the same time, adrenaline made him paralyzed. Those were not men. They were the creatures Bush had spoken of. There, just meters from Rudolph, were the aliens who controlled the behind-the-scenes of power, walking freely in the heart of the White House. For a moment, Rudolph wondered if he was dreaming, if this was a delusion. But the harsh reality hit him. These beings were real, and they were much closer than he could have imagined. At that moment, he realized that it was no longer just a political or diplomatic issue. This was a war for the survival of humanity. With each passing day, the reality about the deal with the aliens became clearer to Rudolph. He had witnessed with his own eyes the transformation of the creatures within the Oval Office, but what haunted him most was the depth and scope of this sinister pact. The United States government, under the leadership of Bill Clinton, had entered into a secret alliance with these beings, something that went far beyond human understanding. Rudolph began to investigate discreetly, using all the resources and contacts he had to understand the extent of the treaty. The truth was frightening. Aliens had been among us for decades, manipulating governments and global institutions for their own interest. It wasn't just the US that was involved. Great powers around the world had also succumbed to the promises of alien power and technology, and the price to pay was much greater than anyone could imagine. The pact did not just involve the exchange of technology. The aliens' real interest was in Earth's biological resources, especially human placentas. Stem cell tissues and other genetic materials were regularly delivered to these beings to be used in experiments that went beyond the understanding of earthly science. They used these resources to develop their own hybrid technologies, mixing human DNA with their own, creating something new, something unknown. Rudolph found records in highly confidential files that detailed these exchanges. There were disturbing descriptions of how groups of alien and human scientists worked together in secret laboratory, away from the public eye. One of the scariest projects involved large-scale genetic manipulation, using humans as test subjects to create a new hybrid species, a combination of human and alien. The worst of all was that these beings did not see humanity as equals. To them, we were just a resource, something to be exploited and discarded when we were no longer useful. And those in power who had been involved in this pact knew this, but were willing to continue with the agreement in exchange for scientific and military advances that would guarantee their global hegemony. Rudolph, however, knew that the pact was about to fall apart. Sign 11 was a warning. The aliens were growing impatient and the demands were increasing. If the government did not fulfill its part of the agreement, the consequences would be disastrous. Rudolph was at a crossroad. He knew too much, but he still didn't know what to do with that information. What he would reveal to the world could change the course of history, but it could also sign his death sentence. The gears were moving, and he felt like time was running out. After the first revelations and direct contact with the alien creatures, Rudolph Harmat Robinson realized that he was surrounded by a network of secrets that extended far beyond what he could imagine. The Dark Pact with the aliens was not just a technology for biological resources deal. It was a relationship of silent domination, where power, fear, and manipulation were the true bargaining chips. In the days that followed, Rudolph began to feel the effects of this pressure. It was as if the shadows he had discovered had infiltrated every aspect of his life. In government, the looks exchanged between officials, the way certain conversations stopped when he approached, everything indicated that many knew more than they were willing to admit. The tension was palpable. It was as if everyone was walking on thin ice, waiting for the moment when everything would break. Meetings that were once routine were now marked by uncomfortable silences and carefully chosen speeches. Rudolph knew that the advisors around him were aware, or at least suspicious, of the true nature of the pact with the alien, but no one dared speak out. It was a type of terror that didn't need explicit threats. The very knowledge that something so gigantic and uncontrollable was at stake was enough to keep everyone on constant alert. Rudolph began to be followed. No matter where he went, there was always a feeling that he was being watched, observed. At first, he thought it might just be paranoia, a result of the rising tension. But then little things started to happen. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, encrypted messages in your email, people who seemed to appear and disappear without explanation. The silence of the government, an institution known for its noisy bureaucracy, was a sign that something deeper was afoot. He tried to maintain his normal routine, but silent terror crept into his personal life. He withdrew from friends and family, fearing that any close contact could put them at risk. Conversations with President Bush, which had previously been about politics and national security, were now marked by a subtext of fear and resignation. Bush no longer spoke like a leader. He spoke like someone who knew he was in an invisible prison, controlled by forces far beyond his power. This terror, which was never named, began to consume Rudolph. He found himself increasingly isolated, trapped in a web of lies and fear that the government wove around him. At any moment, he knew something terrible could happen, not just to him, but to everyone around him. The weight of Rudolph's discoveries was becoming unbearable. The government did not need to threaten him directly. The silence and the watchful gaze of the people around him were enough. He knew that every step, every word spoken or unspoken was being analyzed. His life and the lives of those he loved were at risk. The more he discovered, the more he felt the noose tighten around his neck. It was no longer a question of knowing too much. It was a question of when they would silence him. But it was on a Friday morning when Rudolph received an unexpected visitor that he realized the game had changed. Two men, dressed in black suits and simple ties, showed up at her home without warning. They identified themselves as agents from a government agency he had never heard of. Their faces were pale, their eyes cold, almost devoid of emotion. They entered uninvited, sat down on the sofa in the living room, and with disturbing calm began to talk. "We know what you saw, Mr. Hermit. We know what you are thinking of doing," said one of the men, while the other stared at Rudolph as if he could read his soul. "You have no idea what's at stake. Don't think this is just a treaty. This goes much further, and you're about to cross a line from which there is no return." Rudolph tried to remain calm, but his heart was racing. The second man, even colder and more impassive, added, "We control the narrative and we control you. If you try to go against what is being done, you will lose everything. Don't underestimate the power of the forces you are dealing with. We've had to deal with others before you. Don't make the same mistake." The air in the room felt heavier. The warning was clear. Their silence was not an offering. It was a threat. They weren't there to persuade Rudolph. They were there to make him aware that he was under constant surveillance and that any attempt to expose the truth would be crushed before it even began. After the men left, dread settled deep within Rudolph. The threats were more real than ever. They knew where he lived, who he talked to, what he was investigating. The government, or rather those in actual control, would not allow it to proceed. But what terrified him most was the way the men spoke, as if they were just pawns of something even greater and more sinister. as if they themselves were afraid of the forces they represented. The pressure was overwhelming, and Rudolph knew he was in a game he couldn't win alone. He wondered how long he could last before they shut him up forever. As the days passed, Rudolph began to connect the pieces of a puzzle that became more and more terrifying. His clandestine investigations led him to uncover something much bigger than the United States' pact with alien entities. What he discovered further shook his beliefs and expanded the scope of the threat. The conspiracy was not limited to the U.S. government. It extended throughout the world. Governments of countries that, on the surface, were political enemies were involved in this same obscure treaty. Russia, China, major European nations, and even emerging powers all had signed similar pacts with these entities. Rudolph discovered secret documents detailing summit meetings between world leaders and non-human figures, vaguely described as special interest consultants. What was most frightening, however, was that these leaders, regardless of their political ideologies or religious beliefs, were willing to cooperate with the aliens out of fear of what would happen if they refused. The files showed meetings held in remote locations, away from cameras and the press. At one such meeting, held at a secret military base in Siberia, the aliens had presented their demands directly to world leaders. These beings were not interested in diplomacy or trade. Their desires were purely pragmatic, biological and territorial control. They wanted unrestricted access to Earth's genetic resource, and in return, offered advanced technology, but at a huge cost. Humanity would become its primary source of genetic experimentation. Rudolph knew he was dealing with something much more dangerous than a simple government conspiracy. The most powerful figures on the planet were united under an agreement of silence, ensuring that none of this would be revealed to the public. Any attempt at exposure would be crushed instantly, and the few who dared to try had mysteriously disappeared, their names forgotten in the vast web of secrets and lies. Most disturbing to Rudolph was the uniformity of this alliance. Nations that, on the surface, competed fiercely on the global stage, cooperated behind the scenes on issues involving alien control. The idea that the world's greatest leaders were willing to sacrifice their own populations in the name of power and personal security sickened him. However, he knew that the real enemy was not in the international meeting room. He stood above them all, manipulating like pieces on a board far larger than Rudolph could have ever imagined. With each new discovery, Rudolph felt the abyss deep. The revelations were no longer just about aliens in cahoots with human leaders. Now he understood that this conspiracy transcended governments, corporations, and even the global financial system itself. Alien entities were not only demanding control over Earth's genetic resources, but were infiltrating all spheres of power. Nothing escaped his influence. Politicians, military personnel, CEOs of big technology and pharmaceutical companies, everyone, in some way, was committed to this silent pact. The manipulation was so vast that it seemed impossible to imagine that any aspect of human life was free from this control. Behind the scenes, alien creatures manipulated technological advancement, dictating the pace of innovations that reached the public. The advances we know about, from biotechnology to artificial intelligence, were just a fraction of what they had already developed in secret, always keeping humanity dependent on their inventions. Rudolph discovered that many of the most advanced patents in the fields of medicine, telecommunications, and defense had in their origin traces of alien technology. But this technology came at a price. The price was the submission of humanity. In the insatiable quest for power and control, human elites have become accomplices of the aliens, allowing their own populations to be controlled, manipulated, and in many cases, sacrificed to maintain the fragile balance of the pact. Rudolph now saw the extent of this betrayal. It was no longer just an exchange of favors between governments and beings from another world. It was about the total surrender of humanity's destiny into the hands of forces that had no interest in our well-being. And the more Rudolph investigated, the more he realized that the people around him were involved. He could no longer trust anyone. The control network was so intricate that even his closest allies could be compromised. His isolation intensified every day, and the fear of being betrayed consumed him. Who could blame? He knew that any mistake, any false move could be his undoing, but Rudolph was not willing to give up. With each new layer of conspiracy he uncovered, his desire to expose the truth grew. The problem was that he was running out of time. He knew that the men in black suits who had visited him earlier were not the only threat. The alien creatures with their piercing eyes and capabilities beyond human comprehension were aware of his movement. Rudolph felt that something was about to happen, something big, and that he was in the eye of this impending storm. The plot was now more intricate than ever, and Rudolph knew that his only chance was to move forward. He no longer had a choice. The global conspiracy was growing, and if he didn't find a way to combat it, humanity would pay a price no one was prepared to face. The night was especially dark when Rudolph received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line was cold, mechanical, almost inhuman. "Tonight you will see with your own eyes. Come to the designated place. Don't bring anyone." The message was short but clear. Rudolph knew this could be a trap, but the desire to understand the full truth, even if it was horrible, overwhelmed him. He could no longer live on just fragments of information. He needed to see with his own eyes what was really behind this conspiracy. He arrived at the indicated address, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Washington. The place seemed deserted, but there was something in the air, a feeling that something non-human was nearby. As he approached the door, he noticed that it was ajar. Inside, the air was thick, almost suffocating, and the atmosphere was charged with an energy he had never felt before. The light was dim, but enough to reveal moving figures deep in the warehouse. At first, Rudolph thought they were men, perhaps government agents, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that these figures were not human. Their skin was scaly, their limbs were elongated and disproportionate, and their eyes were the most terrifying thing. They did not shine naturally, but with a dull glow, as if emanating a light that did not belong to this world. Their pupils were vertical, reptilian, and their mouths were full of sharp teeth, capable of tearing flesh with ease. Rudolph was paralyzed by fear, but also by the horrible allure of the scene before him. These were the creatures that commanded behind-the-scenes power. These weren't just rumors or conspiracy theories, they were real. Terrifying, imposing, and above all, immensely superior in terms of power and technology. He watched them as they moved with a sinister grace, like predators that didn't need to hurry. They were gathered around someone, in a ritualistic circle. The object of his attention appeared to be a human. Rudolph held his breath as he recognized the victim in the center. A high-ranking government official, someone he had previously met in meetings at the White House. The man was being prepared for something Rudolph couldn't understand. Before he could process the scene, a bright light emanated from the center of the circle, and the sound of muffled screams filled the air. The experience was visceral. He knew at that moment that he wasn't just witnessing an execution, it was a kind of experiment. The aliens weren't just among us. They controlled us, used us. The truth was naked before his eyes, and it was more disturbing than he could have imagined. After the terrible revelation at the warehouse, Rudolph returned home shaken. He knew there was no turning back. Now that he had seen the true face of the conspiracy, the danger around him intensified. He could feel it. Visits from mysterious men, anonymous phone calls, and veiled threats began to become more frequent. It was as if an invisible siege was being set up around, for the worst was yet to come. One morning, while drinking his coffee and reading the latest reports in his small office, his wife entered the room. His face was pale and his hands shook as he held a letter with no return address. "Rudolph, you need to see this," she said in a broken voice. He took the letter and, opening it, read a simple but devastating message. "We know everything, keep going, and you will lose everything." Along with the letter was a secretly taken photo of his family. His wife, his children, all portrayed in everyday moments, unaware that they were being watched. Rudolph's heart froze. The threat was clear. They wouldn't go after him direct. They knew his weak point was his family, and now they were ready to use them as bargaining chips to ensure Rudolph's silence. He felt helpless, trapped in an unbearable dilemma. Continuing his search for the truth meant putting the people he loved most at risk. In the days that followed, Rudolph emotionally distanced himself from his family. He became increasingly reclusive, fearing that any action he took would result in an immediate attack on him. The fear of losing his family consumed him. At the same time, he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. What he had discovered was too big, too dangerous to be buried. It was during a weekend, while his wife and children were visiting relatives, that the tragedy occurred. Rudolph was home alone when he received a call from the police. There has been an accident. A truck had collided with his family's car on the road. There were no survivors. Rudolph's world collapsed in that instant. He knew immediately that it was not an accident. The creatures, the men in black suits, those in control, they had made good on their threat. They silenced him in the worst way possible, taking away everything he held dear. The emptiness that followed was unbearable. Grief, guilt, and hatred mixed in his mind. The loss of his family was not just a personal tragedy, it was the price for daring to get too close to the truth. And now, with nothing left to lose, Rudolph knew that the next step would be the most dangerous and definitive of his life. He wouldn't rest until he exposed everything, even if it cost his own life. After the tragedy that took the lives of his wife and children, Rudolph was in pieces. His mind wandered between the unbearable pain of loss and the growing desire for revenge. There was nothing left that could bind his loyalty or his willingness to expose what was behind the global conspiracy. He knew he was in a race against time, but now with the death of his family weighing heavily on him, Rudolph was no longer afraid. He only had one goal: to make the world know the truth, whatever the cost. Rudolph began to carefully prepare his next move. He gathered all the documents, reports, and evidence he managed to accumulate during the months of his investigation. There were names, dates, places, recordings, everything that proved the extent of the government's cooperation with the alien entity. It wasn't just a question of technology or science. It was about the complete control of humanity by beings who saw humans as resources, nothing more. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. If he simply tried to release the information publicly, he would be silenced immediately, and his death would be accidental, like so many others. He needed allies, people who weren't compromised by the system, journalists who still had integrity, hackers who could help him release information in a way that couldn't be tracked. It was then that he contacted an underground network of digital activists, known for exposing government and corporate secrets to the public. These hackers, hidden deep within the web, were Rudolph's only hope of ensuring his discoveries reached the world before he was captured or killed. He met with one of the network's leaders in a remote location, in a forest far from any kind of surveillance. They talked at length about the risks, about the lives that would be at stake, and about the impact that this revelation would have. "If we do this," said the hacker, a mysterious figure known only as Cypher, "there is no going back. They will come after all of it. We need to make sure this information is released so quickly and in so many places around the world, even though they can't suppress everything." Rudolph agreed, knowing the risk was immense, but there was no choice anymore. The truth needed to be exposed. In a matter of days, he sent the complete data to Cypher and his team, who began preparing the disclosure operation. But the clock was ticking. Every minute that passed was a step closer to danger. Rudolph knew he was being watched, and every move was crucial. He felt like time was running out. His only hope was that the information would be released before the alien forces and their allies in the government found him. He knew he was on the brink, and the final fall would be devastating. With the disclosure operation prepared, and the hackers ready to release the truth to the world, Rudolph decided it was time to reveal the most shocking secret of all: alien involvement in the 9/11 attacks. For a long time, he believed that the event had been purely an act of terrorism, something that took the world by surprise. But the information he had discovered revealed a much more disturbing truth. 11 was not just an attack planned by extremists. It was, in fact, an action orchestrated by aliens, using terrorist groups as pawns in a game of global domination. The attacks were a calculated retaliation, a message to the U.S. government and its allies after their failure to fulfill one of the key conditions of the secret treaty, providing the biological resources the aliens demanded. When the American government hesitated to continue with the agreements established during the Bill Clinton administration, the aliens decided to act ruthlessly. Rudolph discovered that weeks before the attacks, there were warnings coming from intelligence sources that were unusual. Internal reports, communications intercepts, and even mysterious meetings at the Pentagon and White House pointed to an imminent attack. But these warnings weren't just about terrorism. They contained coded information that suggested otherworldly forces were manipulating events. The attacks were not simply revenge for religious or ideological reasons. They were a demonstration of alien power, showing that they could influence and alter the course of human history without arousing suspicion. The buildings that fell, the lives that were lost, were all part of a larger strategy of control. The aliens knew that by creating such vast chaos, they could force governments to bow to their demands again, and that's exactly what happened. Rudolph found evidence that, shortly after the attacks, secret meetings between senior government officials and alien leaders were held to renegotiate the pact, this time on even darker terms. The September 11th attacks were ultimately a message. A clear message that humanity was at the mercy of these extraterrestrial forces, but this revelation, when exposed, would change everything. The world believed it had faced its greatest enemy that day. Little did they know that the true enemy was far beyond understanding, operating in the shadows, manipulating reality and the narratives that shaped history. Rudolph knew that when this information was released, global perception would change forever. But he also knew that in doing so, he was putting himself directly in the crosshairs of the most dangerous forces in the universe. Alien involvement in 9/11 would trigger an even scarier truth, one that the world was not ready to face, but for Rudolph, sacrifice was inevitable. The truth, however terrible it was, needed to come out. With all the pieces finally in motion, Rudolph knew time was running out. The operation to release the incriminating information was just hours away, and he was fully aware that as soon as the data was exposed, a relentless hunt would begin. There was no more room for error. He had already seen how lethal the system could be, and now, with alien involvement finally about to be revealed to the public, the risks were at an all-time high. The government, in collusion with otherworldly entities, would do anything to ensure the information never saw the light of day. That night, Rudolph was hiding in a remote location, far from any sign of modern technology that could track him. The place, an abandoned cabin in the mountains, was the last hope of safety. However, he knew he couldn't run away forever, and as expected, the inevitable confrontation began. The first indication that something was wrong was the absolute silence that enveloped the cabin. No sound from the surrounding forest, not even the rustling of trees. Just an unsettling silence, then the previously starry sky began to light up with an unnatural pulsating glow that seemed to come from all sides. Rudolph felt a presence. It wasn't a human thing. It was a greater force, almost oppressive. He already knew who, or what was coming. Suddenly, intense lights bathed the place, and the air around him seemed to vibrate with an incomprehensible energy. Before he could react, the cabin doors opened with a bang, and there they were, the aliens. No longer in disguise, no longer hidden in shadow, these beings, tall, scaly, and reptilian, with glowing yellow eyes, looked even more intimidating than in their previous form. But what terrified Rudolph most was the aura of power that emanated from them. They didn't need words to intimidate. The mere presence of these creatures revealed their superiority. One of them stepped forward, his voice reverberating in Rudolph's mind like an unearthly echo. "You went too far. Agreements were made, secrets kept, but you defied our order." The voice was not like that of a human being, but rather a mental invasion, a direct communication with Rudolph's brain. He tried to respond, but it was as if he was trapped inside his own mind, unable to express himself clearly. The aliens demanded that he hand over the information, threatening not only his life, but also the stability of the entire planet. "So we've controlled this world for longer than you can imagine," said the group's leader. "Your civilization is just an experiment, and you dared to interfere." Rudolph, as terrified as he was, refused to give in. He knew that if he handed over the data, humanity would never have the chance to fight these forces that were silently dominating. And then the confrontation reached its climax. The creatures advanced, and he knew that this was the moment of his last stand. Amid the tense confrontation, Rudolph knew he was at a disadvantage. The aliens' technology and power were unmatched. He was just one man facing a force that controlled governments, manipulated humanity's destiny, and turned entire nations into puppets, and yet he would not back down. His hands shook as he held the device that contained the data that would expose the truth to the world. The only chance he had was to release the information and hope that the wave of disclosure was fast enough to reach all media before the aliens could stop it. With one last look at the beings before him, Rudolph pressed the send button. In a matter of seconds, the data began to be disseminated to a global network of journalists, activists, and hackers, all ready to act as soon as they received the information. An explosion of data was flowing to all parts of the world, exposing the dark truth about alien involvement in the 9/11 attacks and the secret agreements maintained by governments over the decade. But at that moment, Rudolph knew his fate was sealed. The aliens would not hesitate to silence it. The leader of the reptilian delegation stepped forward, her eyes shining with cold fury. "You may have won this battle, human," he said, "but the war is far from over." Rudolph felt a wave of cold pass through his body as the leader approached. Her eyes met his, and in that brief moment he knew his life would come to an end there. There was no escaping this overwhelming force, and the sacrifice he was making was clear. But there was also a certain peace in his eyes. He had done what he should. The truth was now out of their reach, in the hands of humanity. Everyone's fate was now in the hands of the public. As the lights around him began to intensify, and the glow in the alien's eyes became more fierce, Rudolph had one last thought. The world would never be the same again. They could kill him. They could try to suppress what he had exposed. But the truth, once revealed, has a power that is impossible to control. In the final moments, silence fell again. An intense white light dominated his vision, and everything went out. Rudolph Harmat Robinson, the man who defied the most powerful forces in the universe, had fulfilled his role. Now it was up to humanity to fight for its future. As information circulated around the world, many still had no idea what was coming. The fate of the planet was at stake, and the final confrontation between humanity and the forces that controlled its existence had just begun. Rudolph Harmat Robinson's story leaves us with deep reflection on the secrets that may be hidden right before our eyes. His fight against unimaginable forces and the revelation of such a dark truth makes us question, to what extent are we manipulated by invisible power? If even entire governments can be under the control of alien entities, what else could be going on without us knowing? Can the truth really be controlled? Or, as Rudolph believed, does it always find a way to reveal itself? What do you think? Do you believe there are forces beyond our understanding controlling our destiny? Leave your opinion in the G. If you liked this story and want to follow more revelations like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. See you soon with more mysteries and conspiracies that could change the way you see the world.